Alright, boys and girls, welcome back. This is our second video lecture in this class, and what we're going to be talking about today are the two different types of law. Law falls into two different categories, criminal law and civil law. Now here on this intro slide I have a picture of the same man, two different images. In the image to the left, this man appears to be smiling, happy. In the right, he appears to be sad, frowning. This man, some of you may recognize him. This man is O.J. Simpson. Now, what O.J. Simpson is famous for is being a former NFL running back for the Buffalo Bills, commonly considered to be one of the best NFL running backs of all time. What O.J. Simpson is infamous is well known for the wrong reasons. What he's infamous for is a court case against him. O.J. Simpson, this was in the 1990s, he was accused of killing his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her lover, Ronald Goldman. Now, we're going to talk about why O.J. Simpson is a good illustration of the two different types of law. But we're going to get to that in just a moment. What I want to do first is just simply run through what the difference between criminal and civil law is, and then we're going to apply this to the two O.J. Simpson court cases. So let's start out with some key questions. And I know that this is a lot of text up on the screen, but I felt like this is a better way of visualizing the difference between the civil justice system and the criminal justice system, as opposed to my usual PowerPoint slides, which involves much less text. So the way I'm going to structure this lecture is I'm going to simply be going question by question over on the left-hand side, and then comparing the civil justice system, which would be civil law, and then the criminal justice system, which would be criminal law. So the very first one that I want to start out with is, what is the purpose of this system and what interests are protected? I'll get the laser pointer here so you can follow along. So let's start with the criminal justice system first. Why? Because I feel like most of you are going to be more familiar with the criminal justice system, because that's usually what we tend to think of first when we think of law. So criminal laws protect the public by regulating actions, crimes that harm society as a whole. So criminal laws are established in theory to protect the entire public. So whenever you have a case against a defendant, a criminal case against the defendants, that case is always brought by the government. And the reason why it's brought by the government is because, in theory, by committing a robbery, you are making society less safe than it otherwise would be. So the government, representing the public as a whole, is going to bring the case against you. Now, this differs from the civil justice system. So what is the purpose of the civil justice system and what interests are protected? Well, the civil justice system, civil laws, regulate the way people treat each other, so individuals will not be financially harmed or have their reputations hurt by others. So when we're talking the civil justice system, we're talking lawsuits. Now, in this class, Law 1, we're not really going to get into a lot of depth about lawsuits. That's more of a Law 2 thing. But it is important for you to understand what the difference between criminal law and civil law is. So in civil law, one individual would named a plaintiff would file a lawsuit against a defendant, claiming that they have been financially harmed in some way, and so they would sue for damages, which I'll get to in just a moment. So I want you to think of an instance in which you have a car accident. So person A ends up getting into a car accident with person B. Person B ends up hurting his or her neck. Person B would file a lawsuit against person A, even if person A, let's say, wasn't breaking any laws. So, what types of cases are heard in this system? As I just mentioned, in civil law, civil actions are called lawsuits. You don't have to put the dash there. I don't know why I have the dash there. Lawsuits would be all one word. And you would file this lawsuit to recover damages. So, damages is a fancy word in civil law for money. You would file a lawsuit to recover damages, recover money from another person. So the example that I just gave you was a car accident. Some other examples would be grievances related to negligence. So an example of this, well, let me talk about what the word negligence means here. Negligence is a failure to use the proper care expected when performing some sort of activity. So if you think, let's say you walk into a Walmart and they had just mopped up the floor, didn't put up any caution cones, you slip, fall, and break your leg. In that instance, you could file a lawsuit against Walmart claiming that their employees acted negligently because they should have placed these caution cones and maybe taped off the area, but they did not use the proper care required when performing that act. So you could file the lawsuit for damages. Breach of contract, this you probably hear of on the news where people are filing lawsuits against other people because they're violating the terms of their contract. Real estate, insurance, consumer protection, divorce, all of this falls under the umbrella of civil law, where nobody's really breaking any criminal law. They're not committing a crime, but you would sue because somebody had wronged you in some way. If you had a roommate, for example, that stopped paying their rent and left you on the hook for paying the rest of the rent, you could sue that person for the money that they owe. Now, they may not have broken any crimes or committed any crimes, but they still had harmed you in some way, and you are entitled to damages as a result. Now let's jump over to criminal law. What types of cases are heard in the criminal justice system? Well, criminal actions are divided into two categories. One being misdemeanors. Misdemeanors tend to be, I shouldn't say tend to be, misdemeanors are less serious crimes like minor traffic violations, simple assaults. They're crimes nonetheless, and you're going to get a criminal penalty for it, but they're not nearly as severe as felonies. Felonies, for any of you that have played Grand Theft Auto, for example, know that these are the serious crimes. Felony examples of felonies would be murder, distributing illegal drugs, aggravated assault. These are crimes that require a prison sentence of over 1 year in prison. Typically, misdemeanors carry with them a prison sentence of less than 1 year in prison. So that's the main distinction between felonies and misdemeanors. So who are the parties to the cases? Let's start out with the criminal justice system. In the criminal justice system, the prosecutor, who represents the government, brings the charges against the defendant, the person who is accused of the crime. So the prosecutor, that's a term that's only used in the criminal justice system. That's not used in the civil justice system. The prosecutor always represents the government. Because remember, and we had talked about this above, criminal laws protect the public by regulating actions that harm society as a whole. So whenever somebody is accused of a crime, they are the defendant in that case, and the prosecutor representing the government brings the case against them. Now, the government is representing us all. If somebody is accused of murder, then they, in theory, are making society less safe than it otherwise would be. So the government is going to prosecute the case against them. In the criminal justice system, the person accused of doing wrong is the defendant. That's the same. So in the criminal justice system and in the civil justice system, somebody is going to be defending themselves in court. However, in the civil justice system, there is no prosecutor. The person bringing the case is known as the plaintiff. So the plaintiff is the person who claims to have been harmed and who initiates the lawsuit. This might be easier for you to remember if you just think of the word plaintiff. It begins with the root word plaint, and I want you to just think of complaint. Who is the one bringing the complaint against the defendant? Well, that would be the plaintiff. So the plaintiff in our Walmart scenario would be you if you were the one that walked into Walmart and slipped, broke your leg, and the defendant in that case would be Walmart. Let's talk about the standard of proof in the criminal justice system and the civil justice system. So the standard of proof is the amount of evidence that is required to win the case. Let's start with the criminal justice system. In the criminal justice system, in criminal law, the prosecutor, representing the government, must prove the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt. Remember that phrase. I'm going to be using that quite often in this class. Do not forget it. So what does that mean? Beyond a reasonable doubt. So I think this illustration really helps you wrap your head around what beyond a reasonable doubt actually means. If it is highly unlikely that a defendant is guilty, then the jury must find that defendant not guilty. If it is unlikely that the defendant is guilty, then the jury should find that defendant not guilty. If the defendant is possibly guilty, the jury must find that defendant not guilty. If guilt is highly likely, the jury must find that defendant not guilty. Only guilt beyond a reasonable doubt is going to result in a verdict of guilty. So this is the equivalent of being 99.9% sure that if there is any reasonable doubt in the jury's mind that the defendant had committed a crime, then the jury is supposed to find that defendant not guilty. So back to this. The civil justice system, the threshold is much lower. Instead of the jury needing to be 99.9% sure that the defendant had committed the crime, a jury only needs to, the plaintiff must usually prove a defendant liable by a preponderance of the evidence. Now that word liable, I didn't use the word guilty there because the word guilty is a term that is reserved solely for criminal law. In the civil justice system, you don't use the word guilty. That doesn't exist. It's rather the term is liable. Liable meaning you are responsible for the damages of the plaintiff. So the standard of proof in the civil justice system is a preponderance of the evidence. The word preponderance is a fancy term that means most. You just need to have more evidence in your favor than the opposing side in order to win the case in the civil justice system. So in the criminal justice system, beyond a reasonable doubt, there can't be any shred of reasonable doubt in the jury's mind But in the civil justice system, you just have to have the equivalent of about 51% of the evidence. What are the penalties in the in both systems? Let's start out with criminal. In the criminal justice system, you are going the defendant may have to serve time in jail or prison. Prison is controlled by the state as or the federal government, as where jails are usually controlled by the localities or cities, counties. Jails usually serve as temporary holding cells prior to trial, as where prisons, it's a little more permanent. Usually people that are in prison are there for over 1 year. Other penalties in the criminal justice system: you may have to pay a fine if you are a defendant that is found guilty, do community service, or complete probation. Now, in the civil justice system, most of those penalties do not exist. There is no jail time, there is no prison time, there's no community service, no probation. Rather, the two penalties that exist in the civil justice system are damages, payment of damages. Remember, damages means money. So the defendant may have to pay money to compensate or make up for the harm that the plaintiff had suffered. So they compensate the plaintiff for the harm done. The other penalty in the civil justice system is an injunction. An injunction is a formal court order for the defendant to cease and desist what they were doing. How does the Bill of Rights ensure fair trials? We'll touch on the Bill of Rights later on in this course, so I'm just going to go ahead and skip this question for the time being. So this also ultimately brings us back to the O.J. Simpson trial. Why did I have O.J. Simpson's face on that intro slide? Well, O.J. Simpson, when he was initially charged for the first-degree murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, was acquitted. Acquitted means found not guilty for the crime. Some of you may know who Johnny Cochran is. Johnny Cochran was one of the attorneys for O.J. Simpson, and in the trial, Johnny Cochran had introduced evidence of the leather glove. There was a leather glove that was found on at the scene of the crime, and this leather glove had blood on it. Well, Johnny Cochran had said he concocted this catchy phrase: "If the glove don't fit, you must acquit." And sure enough, O.J. Simpson takes the glove, puts the leather glove on, and it only goes down to right about here. And then the audience gasps, and O.J. Simpson ultimately is found not guilty for those two murders, even though there is a plethora of evidence that suggests that O.J. Simpson did do this crime. So, but there was still, in the end, reasonable doubt in the jury's mind as to whether O.J. Simpson was guilty. But soon thereafter, the parents of Ronald Goldman, which was one of the two individuals that was killed, had sued O.J. Simpson in civil court. And in civil court, O.J. Simpson lost. That there was, the jury believed that over half of the evidence, which is the preponderance of the evidence, was not in O.J. Simpson's favor, and therefore they ruled against him. They found him not guilty, but liable for the killing of Ronald Goldman, and therefore O.J. Simpson had to pay damages to the parents of Ronald Goldman. At the time of this court case, the American public, which really doesn't understand the differences between criminal and law all that well, were very confused. I mean, how can somebody that is found not guilty of two murders then suddenly have to pay the parents of one of the victims hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, it has everything to do with the two legal systems that you learned about today. Well, that about wraps things up for today. So, hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.